Good morning. Welcome everyone to NC State and the PNC Thought Leadership. Our topic today is Beyond It's Good for Business, Honing DEI Practices in 2021. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Frank Buckless and I am Dean of the Poole College of Management. Please check your electronic devices to make sure they're silenced, as well as please take advantage of the food we have over here. This is our 6th edition of the PNC Thought Leadership. This series was created in partnership with PNC Bank to bring together industry and academic thought leaders to have conversations around relevant and timely topics. It's how we think and do at the Poole College of Management. We thank PNC Bank for their partnership and support. A special welcome to our faculty, staff, and students that are here, as well as the PNC members. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Kearney, PNC Senior Vice President, Data Analytics Group Manager, Corporate Responsibility Group. In addition to this role, Jonathan also co-leads the Eastern Regional Diversity and Inclusion Council. Jonathan is an NC State alum with a BA in Political Science. Thank you again, PNC Bank, and welcome, Jonathan. I turn the podium over to you.
Thank you, Dean Buckless. You know, I was talking to some colleagues this morning, and whenever you're on campus, in my mind, it was just yesterday, right? But when I start adding up the years, I came in past North Hall, where I used to live, and I started counting. I got to 20, and I just stopped. But good morning, everyone. As Dean mentioned, I'm Jonathan Kearney, and I'm happy to be here today. As Senior Vice President for PNC's Corporate Responsibility Group, I live and breathe the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion each and every day. My role may entail measuring the impact of PNC's work, but it is incumbent upon the thousands of colleagues that I work with, and that goes from colleagues at the top of the house all the way to the front lines. And they all partner to help deliver on the organization's DEI commitments. We believe that DEI is core to our success, that embracing and promoting DEI is about being a better company, a better employer, a better neighbor, and a better investment. Today's panel, Beyond It's Good for Business, Honing DEI Practices in 2021, will explore emerging DEI practices and how industry leaders are advancing these practices in today's environment. I'd like to thank Donald, Joanna, and Melissa for joining us today to share their unique perspectives and experiences. I will now introduce the moderator of the panel, Taylor Butler, who is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Poole College of Management. Good morning, Taylor.
Good morning. Let me do a mic check, everybody. Move this a little closer. All right, am I coming through? How's my audio in the back for our Zoom participants this morning? Well, it is lovely to be here. Thank you so much to the administration of Poole College of Management that invited me to facilitate this conversation. Thank you, PNC Bank, for making this a priority, not only in your own organization, but for us at Poole College of Management. And thank you for my colleagues and some students who braved an early morning. I love to see this. I'm so excited to bring to you 3 individuals who I get the opportunity to work with, learn from, and also be in solidarity with in a whole community and societal effort, right? To find ways to live with more inclusion and right the inequities that we continue to see show up in our institutions and organizations. The challenges and concepts we're going to explore today, they are not unique to Poole, they're not unique to NC State. They are common to many of our organizations. And that's why I was so careful to pick 3 individuals who come from very different backgrounds, but also can add some consistent interpretations of what these challenges are and ways that we are working through them to address what we're seeing in our organizations, both systemically, but also what we're working through as individuals. So I'm going to invite each individual to the stage, starting with Donald Thompson. Donald has 2 decades of experience growing and leading firms. He's a thought leader on goal achievement, influencing company culture, and driving exponential growth. As an entrepreneur, Donald's led multiple companies which have attained successful exits and strong returns for shareholders and his employees. As the CEO of the Diversity Movement and Certified Diversity Executive, he's a champion of DEI initiatives. Donald, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. My next guest is Dr. Joanna Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is a full professor of marketing in her 17th year at Georgia College. She's a Georgia Governor's Teaching Fellow, a speaker, researcher, and consultant on issues related to LGBTQIA+, marketing and inclusion. She primarily teaches consumer behavior, principles of marketing, and diversity-focused course that she created on LGBTQ+ marketing. She's a faculty lead for the Georgia College Diversity Faculty Peer Educator Group, and she's worked 9 years in Cox Broadcasting, first as the Vice President for Research and its wholly owned marketing research subsidiary, later as the Director of Perceptual Research for Cox Radio. Dr. Schwartz, thank you so much for joining us. My third guest is Melissa Faircloth. Melissa is our newest addition to the NC State Multicultural Student Affairs Office as the Director. Originally from North Carolina, Melissa is a member of the Coharie tribe and earned her undergraduate and master's degree from East Carolina University, where she's also worked in academic advising. Melissa's most recent role, she served as the inaugural director of the American Indian and Indigenous Community Center of Virginia Tech. In her role on the Blacksburg campus, she planned and coordinated programs and events which affirmed and celebrated Indigenous identity while also advancing campus awareness around issues impacting Indian country. During her time there, Melissa was co-founder of the institution's first inter-tribal program and supported students in their efforts to introduce Indigenous Peoples Day resolution. Melissa, thank you so much for being our third guest in today's panel. Before we start with our questions and we get to explore these areas, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples local to this area and those west of the Mississippi in the establishment of this land-grant institution. We hope that our conversations and our work today honor their legacy and continue our work forward. So friends, what I get to start with is the highest level 30,000 foot view question of the day, which is, what trends did you see emerging in 2021? You know, 2020 was an intense, a lot of activity, a lot of conversations, a lot of ahas, but we're now 3 quarters through the year of 2021. So maybe starting with you, Joanna, what did you see emerge in 2021 specifically in trends kind of in diversity and equity and inclusion conversations?
One of the things that I saw was that it's become an even more challenging year than before. One of the things that we've seen is that while there's been some job bounce back that has been really significantly along race and gender lines, and so our recovery is just a recovery for some. And in terms of the LGBT community, one of the things that I've seen is that a lot of companies, are sort of retreating financially. So one of the things that's happening is their support for organizations that are seeking out DEI initiatives has also been retreating. And I came in from Atlanta, and one of the things about Atlanta is it has a gigantic Pride Parade every year. It's the largest in the Southeast. They didn't hold it this year. One of the reasons was because they've lost so many sponsors. And one of the things I think everybody here knows is that when you lose a line item sponsor, that's 10 times as much work to get somebody else on there. So in ways big and small, I think it's been a very impacting year. And recovery, I mean, it's so cool we can be in a room and on stage not even wear masks. And you know, it's so cool that we're making progress to getting back to where we were, but it's a long way.
It's a long way. Melissa, in our kind of previous conversations, you pointed out a trend that you saw was a shift from kind of what we were supposed to be doing for equity work in 2020 to a slightly different focus. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you noticed in 2021?
Yeah, most of my work has been in higher education, but one of the things I think years ago when we thought we were doing good DEI work was essentially a quantitative approach to counting people, right? We're doing a good job in DEI if we have this number of insert group, right? So it was essentially about representation among organizations, whether that's higher education or whether that's private sector. I think, you know, a lot of the protests that we've seen, particularly this summer, right, as the pandemic struck, those aren't new things, and yet people were really pushing us to dig deeper in going beyond simply counting and looking at policy. And so I think that's true for higher ed, and I think that's going to be true and is true for the private sector. We have to go beyond simply counting that we have folks there that represent XY group and think about what kind of environment we're creating within organizations that enable them to thrive and that so we can also retain them. So I think a lot of that work is going to be around policy that impacts people's lived experience. I saw that as well with students on campuses where they were coming to us and saying, okay, I know I have to be focused on my studies. This isn't necessarily my thing to take up, it should be the institutions, but we're really interested in grassroots type of mobilization. We want to learn how the governance process works within the institution. That was one of the things with Indigenous Peoples Day on my prior campus. The students actually sat down and learned the governance process of the institution, wrote a resolution, took that before University Council, and then similarly I sat down with the Black Student Organization on Tech's campus to analyze like what that process is and how students can get involved in that process. I think another thing is that we're seeing so many DEI positions being created within corporate America. They're everywhere. Every company is adding a DEI role, but I think the long-term question is going to be, is it performative to check a box, or what are they doing in terms of qualitative impact?
Well, that last thought right there really strikes a nerve for what you're seeing, Donald, right, as a trend in 2021 in industry.
Yeah, one of the advantages that I have is I work with hundreds of companies, organizations in this DEI work, and one of the things that is occurring is many people are reacting, right, to the macro conversation without really a game plan of how to drive long-term results. And that actually can create a disconnect, because when folks are trying to understand whether diversity, equity, inclusion links to the business strategy and outcomes, you actually want to move deliberately and intentionally and build momentum over time versus a big splash and no results. And so I try to encourage CEOs and leaders that I work with to be very deliberate and leverage data that they have. Use outside folks to come look at the data with them, because what you'll find is I'll talk to a lot of companies, they'll say, well, we do surveys. I'm like, fantastic. We have employee resource groups. So I'll say, again, fantastic. I'm not your judge of what you do or do not have. What we try to do is add value to do these things correctly so that you drive the outcomes that are in your mission charter and your PR spin. And in doing that, then the questions become that we ask, if you have an executive sponsor for an employee resource group, what kind of education and training has that individual received so that they can be effective? if you're going to hire a chief diversity officer, what are you doing to set the business environment so that that person can actually succeed? Unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of box checking, but however, I don't know, I'm in an educational set, but however, I don't think that's correct. But the thing that is encouraging is that people are making genuine attempts. So if we think about it like learning a new dance step, it looks kind of awkward, even if you know the steps, right? It's not fluid because you haven't done it before. You don't have the experience. And so our goal is to help organizations develop that experience a little bit faster with our help and support, because I am finding optimistically that a lot of people want to understand how to get it right, but they don't know where to turn from people that can share with them the why versus the how to. And the how to is really where the impact is made.
You know, it makes me kind of pop into my mind a connection that has come up in previous conversations, but also kind of here emerging here. You know, Joanna, you talked about inequity in how the job bounce back's coming. You talked about really policy work is really looking at the structure, right, of how we're going to get this equity work done, and then the how, right, is what you're bringing up also. And Donald, can you maybe talk a little bit more about what you brought up, that the positions need more structural work? I think in a previous conversation you kind of said sometimes there's some mishits there.
Yeah, I'll address it, but I'll be brief and create space for others. When you're opening a new position and you've never hired for that position before, how are you going to write the appropriate job description? If you're opening a new position and you've never hired it before, how are you going to assign them mentors and champions to help them navigate through the organization? If you think about chief diversity officers, most of them are new to the organization. Every organization has politics and patterns and really a subculture, if you will, of how things actually get done versus what is in the standard operating procedure of what people hope is the process. And so structurally, right, when you're doing something the first time, that's where you need expert guidance. It doesn't mean you can't do some things successfully on your own, but that expert guidance can at least help you. One of the things that we've done with our clients that we feel like have done well is we sit in on interviews when they're hiring their diversity team. It doesn't mean we decide. It just means we advise and give some feedback and can ask deeper questions. The big thing that I found is people are hiring folks that understand diversity, equity, inclusion from a consulting perspective, which is powerful. They understand the nomenclature, they have a lot of lived experience, but they don't understand business transformation. How are you going to be charged with transforming an organization's culture when you've never had to sell new ideas under duress to the C-suite? And so that's a structural mismatch in expectations for the roles, and that's where I'm seeing some of the struggle. We can overcome it. I am a ferocious optimist, but that's some of the dots that we need to help connect.
Well, what I'm also hearing reverberate is really of our three areas of focus, right? There's diversity, which is counting, who all is present in the interactions. There's inclusion, which is which voices, are able to contribute to the process and creating that culture. But that middle word there is equity. And I'm wondering if we can kind of continue to dig deeper in this concept of equity. How are you seeing the inequities still persist in spite of a big awakening that happened in 2020? Melissa, can you maybe point out what you've been seeing?
Yeah, I think I tend to think about it from, at least within higher ed, from both the employee standpoint and then also the work with students. But then also like universities are a microcosm of like what is experienced out in the larger society, so that they go and they experience those things in the workforce as well. So one of the things, my dissertation research actually focuses on Native students specifically, but we can apply this to all of our student groups. The microaggressions and the kind of trauma that they encounter on a daily basis, it's really up there. And then when we look at whether or not we're resourced well enough to deal with mental health challenges, I've been kind of digging into this trend of suicide rates among college students right now, and it's on the rise. So like, are we equipped to handle the things that students are dealing with on campus? The other thing that I'm constantly thinking about, we're also seeing like a lot of turnover in organizations. Some people are going to other institutions, but some people are leaving for private sector. So then what does our organizational climate look like? A lot of times this buzzword is going around about wellness, right? We value wellness, take care of yourself, make time, but there's a difference in saying that and creating a climate that actually allows for that. So those are two very different things. So those are kind of the main things that are on my mind at the moment.
Yes, I think there's so many consistencies, right, between what we're seeing in our higher education and the impacts on our employee base. And Donald, you're hearing the same things in industry, that some of the established inequities of resources are we're still trying to find ways to solve those.
Yeah, and I think the big thing that has me optimistic, right, is there's so much attention on this work now that people want to know how to be better. And what I try to do in our team and the folks that we work with is, let's not judge where you were, let's create a foundation for what you could be. And what I've found is when we talk about the could be, right, I get a lot more inclusion, right, when I'm speaking, when I'm talking with leaders. Because there is this undercurrent, right, of guilt, of regret, of people that didn't act sooner and different things. That's not my role, right? My role is not a social justice role in every conversation. But it is, how do we link this work to the business outcomes and the wellness and the belonging of your employee base today, tomorrow, and always, right? And that's something that we try to create the right environment, if you will, so that we can have tough conversations, but we can have more people that want to be included in that conversation.
I can just go from there.
Yeah.
Part of that has to do with having the research, right? And you can't understand something if you don't have some way to look at it. And that's one of the reasons especially that this has been important in a student context, because I would imagine that NC State has similar metrics as we have in the University System of Georgia, but in the University System of Georgia, I can tell you that we know how many indigenous students we have. We know how many first-generation college. We know how many men and women and the racial ethnic compositions of our schools. But do you all know the percentage of the LGBT people on your campus? You probably don't. Most schools don't. And one of the things that a lot of schools don't realize is that representation tends to be in itself skewed, right? So on your campus, I'm going to guess it's kind of like our campus. Probably half of 40 to 50% of your LGBT population are probably people who were assigned female at birth who consider themselves bi or pan. And that's a group that doesn't get a lot of representation, but one of the things that we see consistently is that LGBT students, LGBTQIA students, actually have a different college experience than typical cishet students. You were talking about suicide rate. Our university was really upset when our suicide rate ticked up 0.3% over the previous administration of the National Collegiate Health Assessment, which is troubling, right? Okay, this is going up, but we had never broken that data out. What did our suicide rate look like for first generation students? What did it look like for African American students? What did it look like for LGBT students? Our suicide rate, and we're talking about contemplated suicide within the last 30 days or seriously considered suicide within the last 6 months, was sixfold for LGBT students versus cishet straight students. So those are the kind of disparities that we don't even know are there if we don't take the time to take that data and break it down into different groups. So one of the things we've been looking at is, what is the need there? And one of the needs we've also seen from our data is that people who identify as LGBT are twice as likely to take advantage of our counseling services. Unfortunately, our counseling services, not everybody in our counseling services is qualified to help our LGBT students. Because for some people that's, and especially for students who are non-binary and who are trans, for a lot of counselors, that's very far from their lived experience. And so they don't necessarily have the expertise to be able to give that advice. So one of the things that we're looking at, and one of the things that I've been trying to do, is try to inform our conversation better by having more data and better data.
More data, better data, different data, right, than what we're used to just wanting to pull and look at. But I'm also hearing there, Joanna, a story of a need for some additional awareness building and the educational path. So you kind of waltzed, thankfully, thank you, into the next topic that I really would like us to dig into, and which is what are our educational needs of our organizations right now? You're kind of also touched on it a few moments ago, Donald. There needs to be this awareness building. Can you talk a little bit about how you are responding to the educational needs?
So one of the things that's important is that we're afraid of things that we don't understand. We're afraid of things that are unfamiliar, right? And there's an anxiety to it. Think about just driving to a new place where you don't really know the directions and you don't know the time and distance. There's just a little anxiety to it. That is exponentially greater when we're talking about DEI-related topics. So one, we have to create the educational space so that people can get comfortable with things as simple as language, right? It took me time, for example, to understand pronouns and what the importance of pronouns and why I should use my pronouns. Right? I had a talk with my team. I said, well, I don't need pronouns. My name's Donald. Just call me Don, and if we're going to do business together, if you smile, I'm good. Right? And my team had to encourage me firmly, right, that my responsibility was other-centered. And when I have my pronouns on Zoom, I'm creating space for other people to A, ask questions, B, feel comfortable sharing their pronouns. And as a leader, I needed to accept that responsibility to learn and grow more. One of the things that I'm really proud of, a good friend of mine, he is the president and CEO of the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce. His name is Gary Salamito. And Gary sat with me and said, Don, what is my responsibility in this moment? This was about 1.5 years ago. And I said, Gary, the number one thing that I think you could do is work on your personal education journey around DEI. And so Gary entered one of our programs to develop the qualification to become a certified diversity executive. That leadership level, at that point in the organization that's touching businesses all across our state and all across the world, gave people within his team the freedom to start asking more questions, getting more insight, more education. So to wind it, we have to structurally make information available to people in the way that people learn. Some people learn in the classroom. Some people learn through listening to podcasts. Some people learn through micro videos. It is our responsibility as leaders to create an educational path where the information is of high quality and people can access it easily, because people have questions that they're not always going to ask in a public forum.
If I can bounce off your pronoun comment.
Please.
My pronouns are she, her. I was assigned male at birth. So, for me, I kind of want everybody to sort of know. I don't want to feel, I didn't used to want to feel like I needed to say that. But I teach a class that is very specifically LGBT marketing and have so many interactions with non-binary students. And one of the things that I've found is that when you offer your pronouns, when you put them every possible place you can. My pronouns are on my business card, they're on my syllabi when I have a class, they're on my return. If you get an email from me, my address response has that on there. It's on my Zoom. It's every place that I can put it. And one of the reasons I do that is because it creates an environment where students know if they share their pronouns, I'll respect them and I'll make sure that the class respects them. I include a diversity statement on my syllabus, and one of the things that I've had students say to me before is, this is the first class I've ever shared my pronouns in because it's the first place that I felt that I could. And they're not, just to help everybody with like a little semantics bit, they're not preferred pronouns. Your pronouns are your pronouns. Whether somebody respects that or not, it's a different thing. And I've never met anyone who respected somebody who didn't respect them. So, things like that, and it transfers to every area of the way we view other people. That idea of showing respect is vitally important.
That's right.
Consistent value. Melissa, can I prompt you to maybe give us some new vocabulary when it comes to educational need and ways that we can continue to grow, right, and learn more about. But one of the topics that came up in some of our previous conversations is this idea of decolonizing our thinking. Would you mind kind of sharing a little bit while we're on the topic of educational paths?
Yeah, I think for me that's really about, in so many ways, like society can be so averse to change, like we're all averse to change to some degree, right? And then there are those that are vehemently set on maintaining the status quo. And so imagining something different is often a radical first step. So just using your imagination to think about, do we have to do it the way that we've always done it? Can we imagine like a different way or a different system within organizations and within cultures? And also understanding, like you were saying, you're gonna make mistakes. If you're going to do something different than the way it's always been done, don't expect to get it right the first time, and like that's okay. It's gonna be experimentation. But imagining a different way or a different model feels like a radical first step in a lot of things. In terms of education, I think one thing too that we see a lot within organizations is that education often falls on underrepresented folks to educate the majority. And so to your point, take responsibility for your own learning. There are so many resources out there, and a lot of times underrepresented folks engage that education as a labor of love, as a labor of being involved in social justice movements, but it's another amount of labor that they take on that they often don't get acknowledged when it comes to promotion and tenure, when it comes to pay raises, and so that is not valued the same. And so we also have to think about how can we value that alongside of every other thing that we evaluate when it comes to something that can contribute to their personal livelihood.
So true. Can I be teacher Taya for 1 second?
Do it.
I think, right, I think the vocab word to take away is a minority tax.
Yep, minority tax.
Minority tax is the additional work that some of our minoritized or marginalized individuals do for our organizations, but structurally they're not recognized with either compensation or even on the job description or other ways that we typically reward or recognize work that's valued by an organization. There's your teacher Taya moment.
And can I add to your teacher Taya moment?
Please, please, doctor, yes.
And for the professors in the room, one of the things that that I sometimes see is especially commentary from students who have been called out to represent everyone like themselves. It's like I'm the trans professor, and so when people have an issue about, it's just like that idea that if someone is in your class, maybe they're an extrovert and they want to represent, and maybe they're just there to learn, right? And they don't need that extra weight put on them, that pressure put on them. So that's just another way we can recognize that the way that everyone is in the world is their own.
Is their own. And I'm also hearing a call for taking on the learning as individuals, but it really takes my mind to thinking, we are an educational institution. So I'm going to back into this conversation in the following way. What are you seeing or hearing from industry that is what early talent should maybe come into their first career with awareness? Right? Does that make sense? Like, what are we hearing from the needs? Like, do we need to be sending out more culturally competent or responsive young people, or is industry ready to educate on the spot? Don, I'm putting this fair in your lap.
Yeah,
Run with it.
no, I appreciate it very much. I'll actually flip it first and then come back to the question. I think it is incumbent on industry to be able to recruit, reward, and retain, right, the next generation of talent, right, to build an inclusive leadership team and inclusion throughout every fabric of the business. And you got to get started, right, because there's a lot of work to do. And the thing about this talent phase that we're in, People have so many choices that if they do not feel welcomed and they have strong skills, they'll just leave, right? They're not going to go to HR and go through the steps and this is how you work with a manager that's tough to deal with. They're just out, right? And you have the turnover engine that you don't even understand why. And so the first thing I would say is that it's very important from the initial outreach, right, to potential talent all the way through that hiring process that there is strong representation, that language matters. I'll give a very quick story. A friend of mine introduced me to a sales professional and we were chatting. Multi-million-dollar sales producer in the technology space. So it hit $3 to $5 million in quota 5 to 6 years in a row. So this is a very sought after talent in the technology sales space, right? Was interviewing for a new position and was down to 3 or 4 choices. The top choice brought more money, a little bit more prestige, and this gentleman turned the job down, turned down the counteroffer. And they were like, what's going on? You're a sales-driven, money-motivated person. We're offering you top end, this kind of bonus structure. I don't feel comfortable. During the interview process, there were several things that I felt like would be offensive to me or the customers I would try to bring to the organization, and I don't feel comfortable representing this team. Now, if you think about losing out a $5 million producer, that doesn't make business sense. So we encourage our leadership to at least start at the bare minimum of understanding your language, understanding your vocabulary. When we look at students, and I look at NC State, I think you all have a competitive advantage, and I would encourage you all to lean into it even more. If you start to produce a student population in a business context that has a stronger cultural awareness, specific coursework towards it, specific certifications, you're going to create a more sought after student population, number one, but then on the flip side, when you're recruiting from that Gen Z population, you are going to be noticeably different. And all of us are fighting for what is our unique value in the markets that we serve. And so I'm not seeing people really lean into it the way they could at low cost, high impact. And I think there's a competitive advantage there for NC State that I would lean into.
I'm trying to build, please.
Well, actually, I had a random encounter with a faculty member while I was up on my visit this week. And they said, I never imagined when I've been at NC State for more than a decade, and when I got here, I never imagined that we'd be at a place where I could walk up to the College of Business and there would be 2 huge pride flags outside. That creates a message. I mean, everything that we do creates a message, and one of the things that business schools especially have become aware of is that, the AACSB, the accrediting body for business schools, has come straight out and said, we need to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion as the next place that we're going to go. Because if we're training people to become leaders in business,
That's right.
they're at a disadvantage if they can't walk into a corporation and already know how to treat people equitably, how to make sure that they understand culturally the importance of the different affinity groups that a company might have. And so one of our tasks as colleges and as professors is to get people up to speed on what's going to be expected when they get in the workplace. We do it,
That's right.
In our disciplines, and this crosses all of the disciplines.
Melissa, anything to build on, either in the small messages that we should be sending, or what should we be preparing our students for?
Yeah, I think to echo some things that have been said, one thing that I've seen on college campuses is when we've worked with like career services units on campus and career fairs, a lot of the bigger engineering employers, computer science employers, so some of your top recruiters are asking for students who are able to communicate and collaborate across difference. This is a key thing that they are asking for.
Right.
And so when we think about DEI work, we often think that it's targeted just to underrepresented folks, and while I don't necessarily center like whiteness or majority identities in my work, this applies to everyone because we're strongly diversifying workforce. There's statistics that I've seen recently suggesting that by 2045, the white could potentially be moving towards a minority group. Whether that is true remains to be seen. But what we know is that our workforce is very diverse. Employers want those students to be able to communicate and collaborate across difference. So this is important for all of us in terms of job market, in terms of the future of organizations, but then also with the younger generation, they are very concerned with the climate and environment that they're working in. I mean, we're no longer in a time where, like, my parents would work somewhere for 30 years and that's where they're going to retire. If they are not seeing that alignment in terms of ethics, in terms of values, they will look elsewhere, and then that turns into how much money we're spending in recruitment and everything else. So yeah, that request from employers, but also understanding like the generation that is going into the workforce and what they value.
It's spot on. Our 2020 census results were recently released in the last month or so, and our K through 12 student population, there's no majority in our traditional sense of counting heads, and for the ethnic groups, there's no one particular majority. And so that is the trend that we're going to be seeing, arrive on our college campuses sooner or later. And it takes my mind, and it's okay on my next question if you feel the need to take a pass, it's respected.
Now I'm super interested.
Uh-huh.
Like I'm interested, but now I'm super interested.
Well, I would be, I'm going to go out there. There is a lot of pressure on school boards across the state, across the country, to not talk about inequities that have existed in our societal structure. So what kind of pressure does that put on us here in higher ed to try and catch up and fill in maybe some of that knowledge? And if we are not going to be able to do it, what does that mean for our early talent arriving in our industry? Again, if you're willing to offer thoughts on the topic, I welcome it. Thank you.
I have lots of opinions, but I'll be brief. The status quo doesn't give up without a fight, and that's mostly what we're seeing. But you cannot stop the tsunami of change that's occurring in our country. The demographics, the numbers, the way businesses are changing, their brand messaging. If you look at ESG, and we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, but when you think about from a corporate standpoint and governance, right? Environment, social governance, ESG is something that's being mandated by NASDAQ. It's starting slow, but it's picking up momentum. There are consortiums of billion-dollar organizations that are building databases for private companies to start to track this information. So those that are creating that pressure and that hyper narrative, right, of negativity, if you will, are losing. And what we don't need to do is create an environment where we're so focused on those negative aspects that we don't figure out how to continue to move things forward, where the majority of people want to understand how kindness can live in all of the spaces that we interact. The majority of people, some people struggle, they don't know how. Here's a specific point of guidance and a perspective I have on trends. In the local school boards and different things that we hear and read about, there's gonna be some wins and losses, right? The win that we can control is where we link it to the business and financial outcomes that drive the engine of our economy, right? And that's where we have to think about readiness for students in the new economy from a workforce standpoint. That's where I want to spend the majority of the time because I can get the most unity fastest, right? So I'll give a quick anecdote, right? Somebody asked me one time, it's like, well, Don, what is your perspective on critical race theory? I said, well, why are you asking me that, right? Are you wanting to create an environment where we disagree? Let me ask a question before I answer that. What are we accomplishing in the diversity, equity, inclusion work in your firm? And they said, well, we want to have more representation. We want to have more of these. I said, then the past and your view on what we talk about with the past is actually something you're asking me as a smokescreen to not do this work. Now we can go down that path over a beer or over a glass of wine, but our charter for this organization is about representation, it's about equity, it's about inclusion, and I listed probably 50 things that it's about. And I said, now, Do we want to handle that conversation over a bottle of wine and beer and we can have that chat? Or do we want to do the work that we're chartered for? And the person thought for a minute and we got back to work. And it doesn't mean I don't have opinions on lots of things, but every moment, every instance is not the time to engage in things that can take us off track with the work we're chartered to do. And that's how you can get kind of baited in to something that gets you moving from the big goal, right? Sometimes they're setup questions. They're not asked from a really intentional place. They're just trying to get you off track. And so I know that was a little bit of a ramble, but there's more to that after I'll be around. But it's really important that we keep the main thing of what we're chartered to do and our function and where we live. I think that's really important.
Stay the course.
And stay the course.
Joanna, you're about to jump out of your seat.
I just couldn't wait. And this actually bounces off a discussion we were having before the panel started, which is when you think about what we need to do to create an educated student body, part of that is to have them informed about history, all of our history, and we can recognize that some of it is disappointing. And really, the way that we get to a better place is acknowledging that and saying, okay, yes, things could have been better. Things, our history in a lot of places is embarrassing, but when you try to pretend that that was all sunshine and rainbows and that nothing ever went wrong, then you're missing the fact that we were talking about this in a previous talk. Within the last 30 years, it's become legal in the United States to be LGBT. You don't have to worry about being arrested. Only within the last year can you not be fired specifically for that. I mean, within the last year, that's happened. And so one of the things that we need to do as higher education systems is make sure that our students are informed about that. And I come from a marketing background, right? So my perspective is, it's not simply this, I don't want to make it sound too trite, but how do we sell people crap, right? How can I get this person to want this product? And the way I can do that is by understanding that person. And if you can understand, you can't sell to a demographic that you don't understand completely. So, if you want to be able to authentically target an LGBT audience, you need to understand the perspective of the people in that group. The perspective, if you look at, as a company, the Hispanic population as one group, you're completely missing out on what that demographic really consists of, which are 13 primary subgroups, as well as groups within that are identifying related to language usage, the way to, so the point there is, one of the things that we need to do is we need to understand all of our market. When we're talking about products, when we're talking about recruiting students, recognizing that by being better informed about them, which means understanding their history as well as our own, and that shared history, the better we can do that, the more we'll get to a cultural understanding.
Can I bridge this over to a very direct question, Melissa? So, Joanna, I'm also hearing a call not only to have cultural competence for the parts of our markets, our communities that we're trying to either sell to, reach, right, work with, be in solidarity with, but it also means that we're not getting performative in our efforts. And so here's my bridge question. Melissa, the conversation about being erased from history is not new to your work, not new to your experience. So if there's just a few moments, if I could center that this is not a new conversation for you, if you have thoughts to share there, and then also kind of end with why it is so important, even if marketing to local or regional Native American communities, but understanding where those communities are, what their needs are, and how to not misrepresent or appropriate imagery in the process of trying to seek, favoritism in the mass market, it's also pretty important. Care to comment?
Yeah, oh man, that's a huge question. So a couple of things. I'll answer your question by telling like a really brief story. In my previous role, every year we would have a group of German Fulbright scholars who would come and they would visit the center and they would want to learn about the center over the summer. And every year the conversation was, it's really interesting that when we visit America, we celebrate colonialism and we don't want to talk about like an accurate history of what happened. They found that interesting because their experience was that they make sure to learn the history of the Holocaust because they do not want to repeat that. So it's something that's very much kept alive and kind of drilled into them to have that awareness. Contrast that to here, K through 12, what people learn stems into what they know as adults, that Native people are pretty much gone, they're extinct, right? When we have actually roughly 5 million, percentage-wise it's 1%, but 5 million is not no one. So I think, when we're talking about CRT, I loved your point of knowing like where the conversation is going, and if a buzzword is really going to move this into where it needs to go, right? What are our common goals and values, and how do we get there? Can we start with like what our common goals and values are? But to your point, Joanna, within higher ed in particularly, our job is to educate. So when I see institutions shirking back from this conversation, if not disarming false information here, then where? So yeah, I think we have a duty to really unpack what that is, and in very lay terms, it's an examination of historically how legal systems have been inequitably applied to different groups of people, right? That's fact, that's not someone's opinion. So yeah, to say that we wouldn't address that head on is to say that we wouldn't teach legal studies or we wouldn't teach history, which is bogus. So I'll stop there and see if other folks want to add.
I want to add one other, this is awesome, by the way. One thing as I was talking with the gentleman in the story that I made, another thing that came out that we actually got to the root of it. And this was an executive of a very large business, $1 billion organization. And he said, Don, really what I'm trying to say is I don't want to feel like the villain in the room in every DEI conversation. I said, now let's talk about that, right? And that was, we talked, we got, and we got to some real truth of what this individual was afraid of. And we need our middle-aged white men in this work. There is a predominance from a power structure standpoint. So from a marketing standpoint and from a leadership standpoint and things that I'm doing, I've had to work really hard to figure out what are the ways that we can get the most people and the most momentum to push in the same direction. When our macro news cycle, our macro economy is trying to pull us apart at every instance. And it was interesting that we got to a fear, and the buzzwords were really not about the buzzwords, but they were about a fear that this individual had with introducing this work in their company. And so that was a super positive, right, in how we were having that dialogue, and having those conversations leads to really magical moments if you can really get to some truth telling.
Part of that, I think, goes back to, I was doing an interview. I had a reporter come to my office, and they were like, okay, well, this trans thing, I just wanted you to know. I said, well, do you know any other trans people? Do you really understand about that perspective? And she said, oh yeah, I saw Rocky Horror, which is why I'm going to close with a song. No, but what she was basically saying is, I really have no idea about you, and I've decided to go ahead and lump you into a stereotype. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we see is that when people do that, they have these pre-written scripts
Yes.
of who you are. And one of the things that we need is for everyone to get past the idea of that script.
That's right.
You know, we are not just our, those identities. We're, fully fleshed out people who have our opinions that, are based on our perspectives. But, if you thought, oh, well, there's going to be a trans person coming on the panel today, you probably weren't thinking, it's like, okay, well, she's a marketing professor and she's married with 2 kids. And, that's not really what comes to mind, right? And so one of the things we need to do is broaden that conversation, have people have a broader perspective of who everyone is, regardless of their identity.
Well, crowd, that brings us right up onto 9:30, and I do believe that I'm supposed to hand over the floor so that you can ask some questions, because those of you who are familiar to Pool know that I will continue to talk and talk and talk and talk. But I also think if there's anyone on the Zoom link, that there's a way to potentially take questions from those participants, anyone out there. So let us know what is coming up in your minds at this point. It's a small enough room, microphone to pass around, possibly? Yes, okay, I see a microphone in the back. What have I not presented yet for our amazing panelists that is on your mind that you would like to ask from the crowd?
That's great.
Good morning. My name is Maria, and I work at the Poole College of Management in the Marketing and Communications Department, and thank you for this conversation. My question is, for the organizations that have a very specific business goals, right? For example, in higher education, let's say we want to increase diversity among undergraduate student population. So what are the ways that you recommend to go about learning about subpopulations? Let's say if we have a specific time frame, we don't have all the years to research that, but we have a goal for the next year, for the next 3 years. So what are the ways to learn about various populations in order to market to them?
Looks like this one goes to me. One of the things I think that we find, especially in college recruiting, is that universities go to what has worked for them before. They recruit from, like one of the things that you probably recognize are the counties and the high schools that, tend to be some of the drivers of your student population. But the way that you change that perspective is by broadening that reach. One of the things I saw at a recent Pride Parade was a university that had a table, and they were actually, just letting people know, we're inclusive. If you are interested in, if you're looking for a place in higher education, know that your voice is valued here. Going to schools that are, not necessarily the places that you've been before, to increase, the racial, ethnic, and first generation voices that come into your school. And it's important. One of the things that actually makes that stick is once you have students come here, make sure they have the support and the resources for being able to thrive. So one of the things that we have is we have very specifically for first generation students, we have a mentoring, pairing education system that is helpful for them because they're navigating uncharted waters. So it's a matter of talking to more people, bringing more people in, and then once they're here, making sure that you support that.
Yeah. I would add one thing really, really quickly is also don't forget the parents that are a significant influencer. And my daughter Sierra didn't go to NC State; she went to Appalachian State, App State. But I was very concerned, right, about the demographic, right? And so I spent time on the campus, and I just walked the campus. I talked to janitors, I walked in a couple classes were over, and I didn't meet anyone that was not wonderful, right? I literally talked to 10 to 15 folks. But people will do their research, and parents are going to be a heavy influencer on that child's decision, right? That young person's decision. And so I think from a marketing standpoint, a lot of times we tout the goodness of our university and what our folks earn when they graduate, and those things are powerful and good. But I do think that infrastructure of how the student will be supported, the services, those things are lost often in our marketing, and that's what the parents are looking for, right? How is my child going to be treated if they run into a challenge, right? If they don't feel well physically, mentally, or their studies are suffering. So I would just encourage the focus on the student is good, but make sure we're focusing on the parents who are more than ever, right, concerned about the wellness and the social integration, the cultural readiness of institutions that they send their children to.
And advertising out multicultural centers and places that students find representation.
I was actually just going to say to that point, you have to not only attempt to understand those identities, but also the way in which decision making happens in those communities. Similar for Native communities, it's not just about getting to the Native student. There may be a grandmother, an auntie, an uncle. Everybody is weighing in on that college decision for that student. So we have to build relationships with those communities, not just with the student alone.
If you think about it, I'm the son of a football coach. So my dad coached football for 30 plus years and at a high level collegiately. And I played football for a short time. When you're recruiting a prospective athlete, you're doing just that. You know the girlfriend, you know the professor, you know the counselors, you know the parents, you know the uncles, because you don't know the key influencer, right, until you get into that process. So you have to work a little bit harder, actually, right? And that is a great point. And if you talk to your, one thing that would be interesting is talk to the folks in your sports teams about things they're employing and techniques they're using, right, to recruit those 25 scholarships. You can use some of those same methods and thought process in what you all are doing.
So we had a question from Zoom for a follow-up for Joanna. How do we assess the representation of LGBTQIA plus students and employees to get that true number?
That's great. That's a great question. Well, one thing we can do is ask. On most of our forms, we don't have questions that actually address that. In a lot of our student responses in the questions that we give, we sometimes are putting a question out that somebody might not want to share that information. And there's a couple ways that you can find it. One of the most common health assessments that tends to get a really high sample return rate is the National Collegiate Health Association. And one of the things that we can do is we can take the data from that, and this is what we did at our school. We took the NCHA data and ran it through, and when we did that, that was the first time we had actually gotten a realistic representation of our LGBTQ population on campus. It was 15.6%. And that was with a sample size that represented such a large proportion of our students that the margin of error there was plus or minus about 0.5%. So we knew now that about 1 out of every 8 students at our school was LGBT. We didn't have that information before. So that's one way. With faculty, it's really a matter of making sure that they're welcome. Before I was out, I was at a department chairs meeting because I was a department chair, and the Diversity and Inclusion Center had a questionnaire, and on the questionnaire you say, okay, well, this is things that are interesting to me, and when I got to the gender question, the question was, male, female, trans. And I was in a room of 26 people that didn't know I was out. I'm not going to answer that question, right? You know, so if you want to get information, sometimes you need to make sure that students know, faculty know, that their data is anonymous. That, you know, you can say who you are, and that we're not going to micro down, say, okay, well, this person who's trans says they work in the business school, they say they teach this. It's like, okay, well, I've got you. I know this, and I also know what you think about all the stuff we're doing here, right? So, so making sure that you're giving anonymous questionnaires that students know, faculty know, will be treated only in aggregate, making sure that when you run those numbers, you try to really ask the questions in a way that that's inclusive in the first place. Because the way you frame a question, a lot of times can frame the way that somebody chooses to answer. So that, and like I said, you probably have data that you could project out your population pretty well. I could get with somebody later, I can show you how to do that.
Thank you. Yeah, up front, Richard.
Thanks. My question is on how does an external person, maybe an investor, or somebody wanting to do business with a company, establish from the outside really how far that company is on their journey? I can go to their website, I can see a very nicely crafted diversity statement that was probably done by a consultant maybe, and I can see a bunch of really nice stock photos showing a lot of happy, smiling employees of a variety of backgrounds, but how do I really know whether this company's just smoke and mirrors or whether they're doing the real work?
So I have a couple thoughts there, and there's some pretty easy tells, right? And so one is whoever you're talking to, right, ask what the CEO is doing, right, actively relative to DEI work. And if you're working with an organization that the CEO or the leadership is very involved, you'll get answers like, well, our CEO put out a statement. Okay, well, that's baby step one, okay? Right? Our CEO is the executive sponsor for one of our ERGs. Our leadership team is going through executive leadership training on a quarterly basis. There's a company in Greensboro, and I've been given permission to share their name. So the company's name is True Lion, and they're a $2 billion financial institution in Greensboro area. And we are working with their board of directors that have gone through DEI training. Their executive leadership team works with our team quarterly. And their CEO and I meet every 8 weeks just to touch base on the programming. They've hired their DEI lead. They've got their surveys in place. So someone from True Lion would give you a list of 25 things they're intentionally trying to do, right? A startup that we're working with, a company called Curement, if you were looking at investing in a startup, right? They don't have that kind of infrastructure, right? So they've gone through some educational training, some e-learning, right? Their CHRO has attended some different workshops. They've established their DEI council. Really, it's a function of asking the question, but looking for specifics in the answer. That will tell you their intent. It'll take a little more digging to understand effectiveness and things of that nature. But it's pretty easy to tell, right, the press release versus the intentional action that is there. The other thing I'll say from an investment standpoint that we're really, really proud of is one of the larger VC firms in the country, Excel KKR, and they have 43 companies in their portfolio. Their home office, if you will, their venture fund leadership has gone through some of the training, but they recommended, right, that all of their chief people officers build out a diversity strategy. They didn't recommend they use us. They recommended they build out a diversity strategy. But we're starting to see a ripple effect through all of the portfolio companies, right? When one or two are seeing it work and follow the leader. And so from an investment standpoint, we're seeing it permeate, with the money drivers, right? Because they're really starting to see that diversity, equity, inclusion impacts the bottom line for all of the reasons that we would discuss and read about. I think it's a great question.
I'd also add that one of the things that companies' DEI programs that they're actually promoting within their employees, across their firms, one of the things that we see in terms of who are the members of the C-suite, who are the members of the board. An example that I thought was remarkable, given for example, power of the African American market on Adidas US. If you look at Adidas, and this was last year, but last year they had 470 vice presidents worldwide. 2 of them were black. And so one of the things Adidas said is like, well, actually 49% of our employees are are black, because it's a worldwide number. 49% of our employees are black. It's like, well, that doesn't really matter if there's no representation at the top. Mm-hmm. In fact, when I first had this number, it was actually 3 years ago, there were 3. And 1 person left, because if you're in an environment where you're not valued and you're not welcome, you're not staying. So those are a couple things that I look at, just how that representation.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Final thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to echo the leadership thing is really telling, because you may have so much representation at the bottom, but if those people are not offered opportunities to advance, that's usually a telling sign. The other thing, while you can always take things with a grain of salt, people usually don't comment if things are going well, but they'll often comment if things are not going well. The way companies are reviewed on just even online job boards like Glassdoor, particularly if there's a lot of alluding to the climate as it relates to underrepresented folks will let you know. They will be vocal, and so people pay attention to that, particularly when they're looking at their next move and where they want to go.
There's also a great resource called the it's the HRC, Human Rights Campaign, mm-hmm. does a corporate equity index, mm-hmm. and one of the things they do is they rate corporations on how inclusive their workplace is, and that's a really wonderful reference and resource.
So this is going to be our last question. So one more question from Zoom. I hear from the panel that counting heads is not enough for DEI efforts in an organization. So how does one measure the effectiveness of DEI efforts?
So I'll give a resource. So one of the things at the diversitymovement.com is a shameless plug, but everything I'm telling you is free, right? And so we have a guide on our website that talks about the measurement and the ROI of DEI. And so my answer would be dig into that document. It's well researched and gives a lot of KPIs and things that you can take a look at.
And also make sure one of the things that universities do, one of the things that businesses do, is they do climate surveys. Mm-hmm. And so within an organization, you ought to be able to have people anonymously give their genuine thoughts about the climate of their school, of their business. And one of the things you'll be able to do there is try to find foundational problems and solve them.
I recently attended a really interesting workshop on DEI analytics, and so looking not only at equity and things like pay equity studies within organizations, but also how folks are networked into an organization, analyzing communication paths, things that they're participating in. So really seeing how folks are invested and how many touch points they have within an organization. Are they staying within their own affinity groups, or are groups intermingling with each other? So really some high level network analysis within organizations. That was really kind of eye-opening in how we use those tools. But as a qualitative researcher, I would also say, don't be afraid to center the stories and voices of what people are telling you, and particularly within higher ed. I think about the panel of students we just had Monday night for Indigenous Peoples Day. They have their own unique experiences, and we should count those experiences as data and take very seriously what they say their experiences are. So that goes for higher ed, but that also goes for organizational climates as well.
Am I allowed to weigh in one time for one good last thought? I think what I'm encouraging our leadership to do in Pool is to know what we think is going to happen after we do a bunch of awareness building. For example, if we're going to roll out a very effective bias awareness campaign, I would think that I would hear the word, microaggression being mentioned a little bit more often. So, be cognizant of what we think the behavior that's going to change and what it would look like as the behavior is changing, so that we can see, with our own eyes and with our own ears, how that is showing up as impact. That'd be my last thought. We are up on time. I'm sure there's maybe some more inquiry and curiosity to explore. Our guests will be here for 15, 20 more minutes, but please join me in thanking them so much for the vulnerability, the honesty, and obviously their wisdom and guidance that they contributed today.
Thank you for having me. It was really great. Thank you.